Over the coming week on Radio 4, we'll be hearing teenage girls discussing their lives in 2026. It's the work of reporter Catherine Carr, who's talked to more than 150 girls for her new Radio 4 series about the girls. Running through those conversations are the expectations placed on girls today to be beautiful, thin, successful, confident, vibrant. Expectations on a scale new to human history, driven by screens everywhere. It's hard to grasp what this is doing to girls, except I have an 8-year-old granddaughter and I fear for her. Because those expectations, those pressures reach into every corner of their daily lives and into their bodies, into what they eat. Something, it seems, has gone awry in the relationship many young girls have with food, all resulting, is that the word, in a month-by-month rise in eating disorders, mostly amongst young girls. But before we look for some answers, let's talk to Catherine Carr, the reporter behind that series about the girls. Catherine, food wasn't a central theme for you, but it did come up, especially around body image, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And I didn't really set out to ask about it specifically, but again and again, girls mentioned it, often quite casually, mainly to do with what their bodies should look like. So here's one girl I spoke to describing the body ideal that she feels is everywhere.
You've got to have that hourglass figure, realistically, don't you? You've got to be toned, but you can't be too skinny. You need to have thick thighs, but they want a thigh gap. You've got to have like big boobs and like big bum, but you can't have the tummy that comes with it.
And is it coming from girls, social media, boys, real life?
All of the above. I do media studies, I see it everywhere. Billboards and adverts, I see TV shows, and you can see how girls are presented, and that isn't good.
And what she's describing there came up such a lot. And some of them mentioned corners of social media where thinness isn't just shown but really praised. And these videos, even when they weren't searching for them, suddenly appeared in their feeds and started to shape what they saw as success or failure with their bodies.
As a society now, we're constantly kind of made to compare, constantly seeing images, and I think there's such conflicting messages on how you should look or how you should eat, exercise. Social media, so I always say it's like a minefield. I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if most girls you speak to at some point have compared themselves to another girl, whether on social media, TV.
Catherine, it's clear that social media influences how these girls see their bodies. But what do we know about the way that it's contributing to the rising number of young people, especially girls, being treated for eating disorders?
Well, we can't really say for certain because the research isn't definitive, but eating disorder charities are calling for tighter regulation on the content that young people are exposed to. And some of the girls I met felt there was a definite connection. One of them, for example, had been treated for anorexia. She first became unwell at 14 and she's 19 now. She told me that what she saw online did play a part in how she thought about food and her body.
It can overwhelm you. It's like, my life isn't as good as this person's and I don't look like that, and they say I have to look like this, and all of the famous people look like this, so I have to look like this, even though they don't eat or they have a million weight loss drugs, or like they're rich and can afford expensive food. It was a big part of when I was about 15, a lot of this like social media culture about being underweight and stuff, like idealised, and I just see it as quite obvious.
I wonder if you could describe what kinds of reels or videos you are bringing to mind when you think about skinny talk or skinny culture. What are you actually looking at?
More recently, a lot more ads, and the ads will be for like weight loss things, not specific drugs, but like health things, to like a juice cleanse or things like that.
Who are you doing it for? Do you think it's for boys to approve? Do you think it's for other girls to see that you've managed to be thin? Or do you think it's a sort of weird, just permeating culture thing?
I think it can be a range of things. I think it can be to feel successful at something. It's a very competitive thing. To be approved by their parents, to feel better in a bikini. Some people might think it will fix all of their struggles. I think it feels like a solution. It's such a massive coping mechanism for something deep dislike for yourself. And it can feel so confusing when you were very happy before. With a lot of social media, like, create things for people to feel bad about themselves and like feel like something needs changing. That is such a massive issue.
I mean, it makes me feel like crying. I mean, those girls are so intelligent and so insightful, and yet they are so suffering from what they know are ridiculous images, but they're unable to stop it. This culture has shaped the way they talk about food and health and their bodies.
It was so striking that they were sort of aware of the culture and inside the culture and trapped by the culture and performing for the culture. And I wouldn't exempt women from it because they could see women also struggled in the same way they did. So in fact, one of the most depressing things is that they could see they weren't released from it with age. That was really striking. They are so savvy. They understand algorithms and they understand misogyny. But when they talk about food, you can hear the messages that they've absorbed, like oxygen from everywhere. Phrases like, I'm being good today, jokes about dieting. Comparison is huge, comparing their bodies, talking about good and bad foods. It really was one of the most consistent themes across a lot of these conversations that I had. It did feel like they're trapped, as I said, in this conversation. They can see the machine at work and yet they feel unable to step off.
Catherine Carr, thank you. To listen to Catherine's series on teenage girls, search for About the Girls on BBC Sounds. And if you're wondering about the boys, Catherine also produced a series called About the Boys that's still available to stream or download. Listening to those girls, you get a clear picture of what young people and their parents or carers are dealing with and what it does to their lives. A few days ago, I spoke to a young woman who contacted the food programme about the care she'd been receiving. She's 25 and was diagnosed with anorexia at 18. She described how the illness impacted her life.
I've been able to kind of carry on with my studies and work and things, and a lot of people struggle in different ways, and it gets different points to it for different people. But, you know, it's those like other day-to-day living things that it really impacts. So you're not kind of living life. I never feel that I'm actually living, or I'm able to just be in the moment, and it stops you engaging with experiences and people. Like, I know I've lost a lot of years and possibilities and experiences to that.
You'll hear more from Alice shortly, but right now I'm in a studio with Professor Paula Saukko from Loughborough University. In February, she published research into how social media influences people with eating disorders when they're in recovery. Also here is psychologist Kimberly Wilson, the author of How to Build a Healthy Brain and host of the podcast Stronger Minds. Much of her work focuses on how the gut and the brain interact. Paula, let's begin with you, and let's talk first about social media and your research on its effects, particularly on people trying to recover from eating disorders. From reading your findings, it seems algorithms are important.
Yes. Just to start off with, we often think that people with eating disorders go to social media only for the wrong reasons. And I wanted to emphasize that they often went there to look for recovery content. So they logged on to body positive, self-compassion content. But what happened is that the algorithms kept pulling them back to diet, appearance and fitness content that they may have watched before.
Well, let's step back a bit. How did you do the research?
We interviewed 31 people that were mostly in recovery from eating disorders, and most of them were young adult women. Our aim was to find out what they use social media for, and then we found out that they were slipping back and forth between positive and negative, partly because algorithms kept them in this going back and forth mode.
So even if they wanted just to do the positive things, all this stuff just kept popping up about, skinny talk. Did skinny talk pop up?
Yeah, mostly they viewed quite common videos like, what do I eat in a day? And, there are young women eating a little bit of quinoa or salads. So it wasn't pro-eating disorder content. It was quite common fitness, everyday diet content.
I mean, you might ask, if you developed an eating disorder and you understand something about how social media might have had some impact on that, couldn't they get off social media?
No. Well, I think it's the habitual form of passing time to scroll. I mean, some people that were very much in an acute stage and wanted really to recover, they said that they had deleted Instagram, but those were very much in the minority.
Is it that you're saying it's social media that's the main disruptor of any attempt to get back to an unself-conscious relationship to food?
I think that probably has quite a lot to do with how we see food, especially for the younger generation. But obviously it's not the only thing, so we shouldn't fall into the trap and say that social media causes, for instance, eating disorders. But yes, because people spend so much time on it, so it's kind of always with you. It's there first thing in the morning, between your breaks. It's there last thing in the evening.
So, it's part of a complex set of causes, but would a social media ban for under-16s help?
I think that the social media ban for under-16s tries to address negative effects of social media. But we need to remember that a total ban also bans children from other things. And then the other thing is that we interviewed people that were 18 to 25 and they were being harmed by these algorithms. So I think that a wider perspective is needed rather than protect the under-16s.
What about more serious action from government to control the companies?
Yes, well, we would obviously see that as a benefit so that, people would have more control of what they see, so that when they are in recovery or trying to get better, that they could actually stay in places that are safer and also expand their interests beyond food and fitness and wellness.
Well, we contacted TikTok and Meta, which owns Instagram and Facebook, to ask them about what they were doing to control what's being seen by young girls online. TikTok told us it wants everyone to feel comfortable and confident to create and share exactly as they are. It says it has firm rules in place to help encourage self-esteem, reduce negative social comparisons, and address content that shows or promotes disordered eating and other dangerous weight loss behaviours. It says it does not allow showing or promoting disordered eating or dangerous weight loss behaviours, and that this includes facilitating the trade or marketing of weight loss or muscle gain products. Meta told us it has never allowed content that promotes, encourages, or glorifies eating disorders, and says it removes such content as soon as it becomes aware of it. It says it also removes content that makes miraculous claims about diet or weight loss products, and both content and advertising promoting weight loss products or cosmetic procedures are restricted to people over the age of 18. It says if adverts show unrealistic results or encourage negative self-image in order to sell a product, those ads are rejected. And the government? Let's hear their reaction to our request for a comment.
Everyone deserves to use the internet without being exposed to content that puts their physical and mental health at risk. Through the Online Safety Act, platforms are required to protect children from harmful content, including material related to eating disorders, self-harm and body stigma content. And the Act will also soon empower adults to gain greater control over their own feeds.
Do you think that's an adequate response, Paula?
The thing there is that the so-called pro-eating disorder content has been moderated on social media for a long time, over 10 years. It still exists because people use hashtags and, evade the moderation. But that's separate from the kind of everyday diet content where somebody's very thin, eats kale and quinoa and dances to a tune, which is not seen as self-harm. It's just regular diet content. And those people that we interviewed said that this was the kind of content that got them into trouble.
But Kimberly Wilson, let's get your thoughts about Paula's research. Your work has cast a really strong light on what's happening to teenage girls' brains during adolescence. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, concerns about body image, particularly in girls, it's growing in boys and men as well, starts incredibly early. We can see children being worried about their bodies from the ages of 5, 6, 7, 8, when really they start to become aware of other people's opinions of them. And what happens in adolescence is that there is a kind of shift in the focus in the adolescent's mind, where what their peers are doing and their peers' opinions of them becomes much more important than what their family is saying about them. And almost to the point where sometimes we think that they can't even hear their parents' voices. It's almost as if these external voices are much, much louder. And in a sense, there's a kind of evolutionary basis for this, which is it's about that is a stage of life where they're moving into the social world. They're starting to express their independence more. And so that's, we think, is the kind of neurological basis of it. But what it does is to make them incredibly vulnerable to the quality, nature and quantity of those messages. And then we also have the kind of influx of an aspect of human psychology which we can't escape, which is social comparison theory, which is, we're a social species, we're also a hierarchical species. And so we're always trying to work out where we fit in the social hierarchy. We call upwards and downwards comparisons. We'll look at someone who we think is better or above us on a particular quality, and we can either see that as aspirational, or we can find it kind of disappointing or feel that we are not meeting up to those expectations, and that can be quite dangerous for our self-esteem. Or on the other hand, we can make a downwards comparison and momentarily feel better about ourselves. The thing is, that mechanism evolved when we were in much smaller, much more homogenous groups. And I might compare myself to someone who I'm largely similar to, but who's a bit taller than me. But I might sing better than them, or I might be stronger than them. So actually, the broader differences equaled out. I think what happens now, and it's a kind of personal theory of mine, is that social media, particularly image-based social media, really perverts our understanding of what a peer is. So a young person can be scrolling through images of their friends, sure, but then an image of a supermodel or an image of a Hollywood actor who has all sorts of resources and time and money in order to achieve a particular aesthetic, but their brain perceives them as someone who is a peer and someone with whom it's relevant and applicable and reasonable to compare myself to. And that's hugely dangerous, I think.
Paula, eating disorders, if they're not treated, they don't just end, do they?
Well, the sort of sad thing is that about half of people with eating disorders actually don't recover. So the recovery rates are sadly quite low, and 20% become chronic.
And really, we should say at this point that, it's not just anorexia nervosa. I mean, there are other eating disorders, binge eating, bulimia. They're often overlooked, but, they were part of your research study too.
Yeah, we studied people with different kinds of eating disorders, and quite a lot of them had many different eating disorders and shifted between restricting and binging and purging.
Well, let's hear more now from Alice, the young woman who contacted the food programme about her experience of anorexia and its treatment. As I said, she's 25 and was diagnosed 7 years ago. She emailed us at the food programme to tell us that the food she was served during treatment made recovery harder. Alice now lives in London and works in mental health services, but not with people dealing with eating disorders. So let's hear from her.
I guess I've been diagnosed with an eating disorder for several years. And as part of that, I've attended and undergone different sorts of treatments, kind of talking therapies. But I've also had experience of inpatient and day patient programs in NHS hospitals and setups. The reason I got in touch with the food programme is really with regards to the food that was provided in both the inpatient and day patient programs that I attended. And part of eating disorder treatment, food is medicine, as they say, and food therefore is one of the most important things. And the food standard at these places was pretty terrible, to be honest. In both settings that I was at, the hospitals had both switched from cooking fresh food to frozen ready meals, essentially, but really poor quality. So bland, always served kind of cold. Often the vegetables were just overcooked and it was complete mush. A lot of us felt that we just didn't need teeth or jaws necessarily to actually eat the food. And I guess maybe once or twice, if you're staying briefly in hospital, that's fine. But when you're there for months, as you are during those treatments, it's really not great.
How much were you able to eat?
Well, the thing about eating disorder treatment is that you have to eat everything. If you don't, then you have to take supplement drinks. So that's not something that I ever did, but you just eat it because you have to. And actually, a lot of the time, you're hungry during part of that. And that's something which is kind of hard to acknowledge for a lot of us. But you are, and you want to eat something, but you don't want to eat that, but you have to. I want to say that the staff at both places I went to, they really care, but they have no choice but to watch you eat it. And they don't want to eat the food, so they won't eat it themselves.
And had you had experience ever of being in a place where food was freshly cooked?
Yeah, once. And honestly, it was just such a difference and such a privilege to have good for you food, not just kind of health-wise, but good for you, like mentally and well-being and taste and enjoyment-wise.
If you were given the task now with your experience of redesigning the food side of treatment, how would you do it?
You know, I'd reinstate a kitchen team, a chef who could do this. They've got the tools, they've got the knowledge, and there are people with that passion. In terms of a sustainability mindset, I'd try and source local and, you know, kind of set up a really strong skilling program for people who are moving through treatment and are at that stage of learning to cook for themselves, because that's a really important process. And don't get me wrong, there was some of that provision being set up at the places I went to, but not nearly enough.
And do you think of yourself as recovered now?
No, definitely not. It's different for everyone, you know, but ultimately you have to do the real work and you kind of have to want it. And a lot of people say that you can't ever recover fully, but I don't believe that's true. It's just not something that I'm near yet, or, you know, I've been able to touch yet.
We approached the NHS Trust where Alice was most recently treated, part of Dorset Healthcare. They told us,
the use of an outsourced food provider at our Kimmeridge Court unit was a temporary move due to capacity and recruitment challenges, not a strategic shift in our approach. Our long-term aim remains a high-quality in-house service, with outsourcing used only as a contingency. We continue to provide a bespoke, patient-centred menu at Kimmeridge and are working to improve the current offer through the introduction of freshly cooked sides, improved food temperature and an expanded menu choice.
Kimberly, what do you make of what you just heard from Alice and then the response?
Eating disorders are enormously complicated. They're not just about the food. They're about how we deal with predictability and chaos and anxiety and overwhelm, and as well as genetic risk factors and that sort of thing. But the food is important because the food is the kind of focus of the anxiety. And what makes it incredibly difficult when the food quality itself is poor is that it adds a layer of difficulty, right? Because on one hand, there's a need for patients to engage with challenging foods. Often they come with a huge list of rules around what they can and can't eat and what's good and what's bad. But if the quality of the food itself is poor, then it almost gives them a kind of justification and a reason not to eat, if we're talking about kind of restrictive eating disorders. And that makes it much harder to engage with the process of recovery. Then if you're looking around and the staff who are treating and supporting you are disgusted at the food and they wouldn't eat it, that is really harmful when we're trying to think about actually the self-esteem, the internal narrative that the patients might be presenting with in the first place.
Paula, what do you make of it?
Well, we have a project where we actually study inpatient treatment and the relationship between patients and staff. And one of the issues there is that oftentimes people that are inpatient, their views or their criticisms are completely bypassed and said, well, you're just saying that because you have an eating disorder. And that is very detrimental. And that in our project is the number one difficult thing between staff and patients, that if you're never taken seriously, it's very difficult for you to think that you are in a place that will be helpful for you.
Kimberly, can we sort of move on slightly, it was related but slightly different subject. Your research into ultra-processed foods, which now make up over 50% of what we eat in the United Kingdom, but amongst children and teenagers is higher. And we now have high-quality research from around the world that now shows the major impact of this on physical and mental health. Even before the research gathered together in the Lancet report published last year, your book, Unprocessed: What Your Diet is Doing to Your Brain, was very insightful about the impact of these foods on your brain.
Thank you. Yeah, and I try to tread quite a careful line, because it's not the case that a single ultra-processed food or fast food meal is a problem, but it's kind of about how these foods disrupt and displace other more nutritious foods and ways of eating, and how really they're sold to us as a solution to the problem of food, to the problem of cooking, because cooking takes time. So there's a way in which something that we've been doing since the beginning of human civilization, somehow that's been turned into an enormous problem. You don't have time to do it. You don't have even the compunction to do it. In fact, it's a waste of time. It's a time sucking. You should be doing something else more important.
Doom scrolling.
And instead, we're going to present you with, by definition, nutritionally poorer foods, because we know that as soon as you process a food, so if you take a whole grain, whole wheat, for example, and you refine it into white flour, you lose something like 80% of the magnesium. And we know that the higher a proportion of your diet is made up of these industrialized foods, the lower your intake of things like omega-3 fatty acids, a range of minerals, vitamins B, 9, 12, nutrients that are essential for brain health.
So what do we actually know about the relationship between ultra-processed foods and mental health, especially in the context of eating disorders?
So it is a really moving landscape, and nutritional psychiatry is a very new area of research. And so on one level, we have epidemiological observational data, which is showing an association between diets high in ultra-processed foods, or conversely low in whole foods, and an increased risk or propensity for things like depression and anxiety. And there are questions around, the nature of the causality. But we do see certain associations with individual foods. So there has been data linking a higher consumption of energy and soft drinks with increased anxiety in young people. And we certainly see some data associating intake of certain emulsifiers with poorer gut function and lower diversity of gut microbial communities, and associations with kind of then things like mood and brain fog and mental clarity and so on. So it's still a kind of growing area of research, but what we do see is these kind of broader associations with actually the more nutrient dense your diet, the lower risk you have later on. So if we look at people at baseline and say, what is the quality of your diet? And then we follow you over 10 or 15 years, those people who have a healthier diet at baseline are much less likely to go on to develop depression and other common mental health conditions.
Paula, you've done work for the eating disorder charity Beat, and they're concerned with what they called demonizing ultra-processed food. And, we can all agree demonizing is never good. But given what we now know about the damage UPFs do, that is a problem. I mean, how do you begin to shift what food is attractive and available to teenagers?
I think that there is a dangerous kind of a balance to be stricken if we start thinking that certain foods are really, really dangerous, because it might play into the eating disorder mindset that I absolutely cannot eat those things or I will be a bad person. But I think that the moderation there is probably the key.
Well, we wanted to explore whether cooking and learning about food when you have an eating disorder has any effect. And recently, Ealing's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, CAMS, started offering cooking classes to the teenagers, mostly girls, that they're treating for eating disorders. And they're being run by dietitian Isis Stelmo.
One part of the treatment, usually the middle to the end, not in the acute phase, that I offer to those that voice that they think it would be helpful for them to practice cooking skills, to overcome some fears that they have around food. And to also instill autonomy, because they are in that phase of adolescence that they want to become independent adults.
So what did you cook in that very first session?
We did vegetarian sushi. First of all, I discuss with the family or with the young person. They usually say, I would like to do this recipe. Sometimes it's the first time that they're doing that in their family home.
So you go into this. What's your goal, really, of these sessions?
I hope that they have this feeling of accomplishment and empowerment and overcoming. Sometimes there are some ingredients that can bring some fear. I remember when I did the sushi, for example, the sushi rice recipe includes a bit of sugar. And there was some hesitation from the young person. And I had to say, no, it's okay, it's fine, it's part of the recipe. So making a sushi that has a little bit of sugar and it's also rice, it is a super achievement because it's meeting a lot of fears there.
And reading about anorexia nervosa in particular, it seems like perfectionism is a problem. And what you are describing, they're using all their senses. That sort of messes up perfectionism, doesn't it? You know, when you're tasting and smelling and feeling.
One of the characteristics as well in eating disorders is sometimes avoiding feelings. So this whole experience of being in touch with food, eating, sitting with the family, smelling, because in eating disorders, food becomes the enemy. So it's about restoring this relationship and say, it's fine, it's okay, you need to eat to live. And then why not making this moment a pleasurable one? And one thing that you mentioned about the perfectionism, it's true. And in the kitchen, we can make a lot of mistakes. So it's about instilling that creativity as well.
If resources and space weren't an issue, what would you like to be able to offer the girls that you're working with?
Thinking about the dream, I would love to have an edible garden in the community. And then if we have the space one day for the kitchen, starting offering these groups. My dream is also working a lot with prevention and promotion. So maybe expand to other COMS services, not just the eating disorders, but this is a dream and wishful thinking.
Isis Stelmo from Ealing's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. Dump the Scales is a 4-year-old campaigning organisation of carers, clinicians, and, as they say, people with lived experience who are committed to, quote, ending the injustices of those affected by eating disorders. Their figures show that more than 4 million people are living with that life-altering problem in the UK, and they quote research showing that more people die as a result of eating disorders, from the physical damage they cause and from suicide, than from any other mental condition. Next week, they're urging the government to set up an eating disorder strategy to improve care. Dump the Scales was founded by Hope Virgo, the author of several books, including Stand Tall, Little Girl, about her own experience of anorexia and recovery. A few weeks ago, she spoke to producer Natalie Donovan as she and a group of teenagers were shooting a short film, Real Illness, Real Recovery, about to be released online to accompany the campaign.
We're launching the next phase of Dump the Scales, which is calling on the government to commit to a standalone eating disorder strategy, starting off with a full inquiry into eating disorder services. We wanted to create a campaign video to get across the harrowing reality of what it's like to live with an eating disorder, to show that eating disorders can be hidden completely in plain sight. So yeah, we've been working with a school in Bristol to tell this story.
Our programme's about teenage girls in particular. Why are they so affected, do you think?
I think firstly, there is a huge pressure on teenage girls. I think there's a huge pressure from modern society, which affects obviously everybody, but particularly kind of in that space. We know you've got pressures to perform well at school, you've got pressures to look a certain way, to be a certain type of person. And I think beyond that, whilst we cannot categorically say that social media does cause eating disorders, they're much more complicated than that. We do know that if someone has a genetic predisposition to developing an eating disorder, and perhaps they see something on social media, they get bullied, something like that, that could then trigger them to change up their eating behaviours, which will cause their brain to go into an energy deficit, and then that will cause the eating disorder. And I think as well, because we don't talk about this stuff enough, we don't talk about our emotions, we don't talk about how to deal with things around life, we also have a hugely unhelpful information around food out there. Again, you look at something like social media where you've got all these wellness influencers, and actually a lot of those wellness influencers are normalising eating disorder culture across society. So people don't know how to eat, they don't know how to exercise in the right way.
Something else that's happened in the world of dieting more recently over the last few years is the introduction of weight loss injections.
So the really scary thing with that, I think, first is the people that I work with in schools a lot of the time are using their parents' identity, they're using AI, they're using anything they can to kind of change photos of themselves so that they can then access them. And we're seeing a huge increase in that happening. And I think that's, for us, is a really big issue in itself. And we know that because of that, we're seeing more people going into eating disorder services. I look back over my life and I was so in the grips of an eating disorder without realising it from the age of 12 to 18 that I didn't really have that time in my life. I think one of the really hard things is people with eating disorders tend to be really high achievers and real perfectionists. And so then we just kind of mask up and pretend like everything's fine. And I meet a lot of people with eating disorders who are functioning at a really high level. And it's that cohort of people, amongst many other, that we're failing.
Hope Virgo from the Dump the Scales campaign, talking to producer Natalie Donovan. We asked the Department of Health for its response to this campaign, and it told us,
For too long, people with eating disorders have not been getting the support they deserve. That's why we're working with NHS England to strengthen community-based eating disorder services and improve outcomes and recovery for patients of all ages. Through our 10-year health plan, we are also transforming mental health services. Over 8,000 extra mental health workers have been recruited since July 2024, against our target of 8,500 by the end of this Parliament. And we're reaching nearly 1 million more children by expanding mental health support teams in schools.
Well, Kimberly Wilson and Professor Paula Sauco, if you were given the power to make policy, what do you think would make the most difference to the lives of teenage girls? Paula?
Well, since I here talk about social media, I think that it really would be a good thing if people would have better control of what they can see on their phones that take such a big part of their time, and that they could decide that they're going to move into different content, and also that it would be easier for them to actually see different things and not just one thing. I also think that there are lots of educational initiatives about body image in school, which is good, but they are now not up to speed with the technology. And so a lot of the young people that we have talked to, they say that, well, they are talking about avoid these standardized images of beauty, but they don't instruct us how can we deal with the recommendation system and how could we learn about them and learn to manage them better. They will never be able to fully control them unless some dramatic changes are going to take place. But I think that people would need some skills to be able to better manage their social media use.
Kimberly?
Yes, I would agree with all of that. I also think, because we do see some very recent data showing an interaction between mother's selfie usage and this kind of complex interaction then between a daughter's selfie use and her feelings about her body. So, there might be a role for educating parents about the kinds of comments and conversations that they have around other people's bodies. Maybe they're not saying anything about their daughters' bodies, but they're talking about themselves, or they're commenting on a woman walking down the road. But their daughters will be taking this in and they will be overlaying the meaning and the value judgments that they hear in these comments to themselves.
But that's hard to legislate, isn't
It's
it?
incredibly hard to legislate, but I think there's a kind of educational piece.
The question we asked at the top of the programme is, what went wrong? What went wrong, Paula? Why are we seeing this steady increase in eating disorders?
I think that it probably has to do with the broader mental health crisis. And so the eating disorders are just part of this bigger picture. But just to go back to the idea of regulating tech, I think that sometimes we need to think about things in historical perspective. And we are here at BBC. At its value, the idea was to give people a varied diet of information that would educate them and enlighten them. So you can look at news and football and nature documentaries and children's programs. And that used to be the goal. And now we've kind of forgotten that actually we sort of think we can't regulate anything. We're just kind of powerless against these companies. And we could actually say that, well, it wasn't so long ago that there actually was a media policy and the idea that media serves the greater good and not just put our hands up.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we have to intervene much earlier with mental health crises. I always think we need to try and intervene much earlier with at-risk families. How do we properly fund mental health services so that illnesses are caught early before they become really entrenched and intractable and much harder to treat? And how do we create a social environment that is conducive of just well-being and thriving? I mean, this is a very utopian idea, but where we can value people for their intrinsic qualities and personhood and not so much for what they look like.
Thank you very much, Kimberly Wilson and Professor Paula Sauko. Is it utopian to strive to value people for who they are? It certainly seems dystopian to carry on treating children and adolescents as a marketplace. I asked at the beginning of the programme what's gone wrong with teenage girls' relationships to food, given the year-on-year rise in the number of them suffering from eating disorders. Is it the food itself? Social media? Family life? Something else? Well, as you heard, it's all of the above, including that something else, which, as you listen to those girls recorded by Catherine Carr for her About the Girls series on Radio 4, you can't but think is linked somehow to that strange world we've created over the last few decades where money and what it brings is the measure of us all.
Hello, I'm Johnny Diamond and I'm the presenter of the Radio 4 series How Did We Get Here? Israel and the Palestinians. We explore the complicated backstory of that Middle East conflict as the region endures another wider war. Through conversations with experts with a variety of perspectives, we travel back through the centuries to examine the history of the land that's now so contested between Arabs and Israelis, and we try and understand the past that's brought us to such a present. How did we get here? Israel and the Palestinians. Listen on BBC Sounds.